Hello, everyone, and welcome to another live session at the Reactors. Before we begin, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful of other people's views, understanding of differences, and please be kind and considerate in the way you engage. Today's session is on pushing the boundaries of sustainability leadership with AI. And our speaker for today is Darshna, who is Microsoft AI MVP. Before we start this session, I just wanted to wish you all a very happy International Women's Day. And we are so delighted to run this session with Darshna today, who is an absolutely amazing woman in tech. So with that, I'm going to now add Darshna into the stream. Welcome, Darshna.
Hi, Rav. Thanks for that really great introduction. Happy International Women's Day, everybody. I hope you've been having a great day. And thanks for taking time out of your day to join me on this session on pushing the boundaries of sustainability leadership with AI. I'm just going to bring up my slides. Rav, if you don't mind, could you just let me know when you can see them?
Yes, we can see your slides now.
Okay, perfect. Great. Okay, so before we get started, I'd just quite like to take a few moments just to ask you, why is sustainability AI important to you? Feel free to drop your answers in the chat or reach out to me. I'd be really interested to hear why sustainability AI is important to you. For me, sustainability AI is important because I see data as the foundation steps to really be able to measure and monitor change towards these progressive goals that are becoming day by day more and more of an urgent requirement. And I see AI, more importantly, as the kind of next steps of tools which will really take us to that progressive change more quickly. So with that, I will share an interesting fact with you. So a recent study by an academic study by Goldsmiths University done in conjunction with Microsoft revealed that only 41% of organisations are on track to meet net zero targets set by the government for 2050. And while this is quite a worrying kind of revelation, it's not entirely shocking. From a lot of conversations I have within the sustainability space, it's quite obvious that whilst awareness has generally grown, which is a great thing, leaders are kind of bombarded with a lot of different types of information, whether it's regulation or ESG frameworks around what type of data should be collected, or what are the latest kind of technology advancements which can be used to meet sustainability goals. And that can be quite overwhelming when a lot of these leaders and general kind of workforces are dealing with their day-to-day business as usual engagements as well. So the aim of this talk, which I hope you guys will find interesting, is to really break down that noisy information. And while a lot of it is kind of domain specific, I see this information as kind of really fundamental within the tech industry, because if we are to create effective solutions, we really need to understand the problem domain. And the second kind of goal is to basically inspire others to use data and AI to influence change towards sustainability. So before we get started, I'll just give you a bit of background around who I am. So my background is in neuroscience. For the last couple of years, I have been working within data science and cloud consultancy. And more specifically, since about 2018, I have refined that focus to kind of work in the sustainability space. So I originally started developing AI solutions within renewables. And just in the last year, I have been focusing within the ESG space and developing products there. I was really happy to receive my first AI MVP award from Microsoft, and that was kind of really tied to the large data science London group that I run, which has over 10,000 members. Tried to keep it engaging, covering a lot of different topics within data science. So please feel free to check it out. I also do a lot of tech blogs and talks. And when I'm kind of not engaging in the technical arena, I like to set myself physical challenges on the side as well. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me. Always looking to engage with different types of people around technology and sustainability. And in terms of the agenda today, so I'm going to cover some really interesting kind of findings from a few research pieces around sustainability leadership, the type of power skills that we can instill within teams that are really fundamental for sustainability. And then we're going to start breaking down a lot of that noisy information, focusing on ESG frameworks, some of the regulation that's come about and how that applies to investors and corporations, voluntary carbon markets, and then I have a few different demos that are focusing specifically on emissions. So to kind of get started, a recent conference board CEO survey kind of questioned 80 different executives from various different organizations to ask them what do they see as successful leadership within sustainability. And there were kind of 7 themes that emerged quite consistently from those interviews. So the first kind of theme was active engagement. So as I mentioned, awareness around sustainability has grown quite rapidly over the last few years, which is great. But for leaders, that's not quite enough. You really need to kind of consider how the certain sustainability trends are impacting the day-to-day business. And kind of 2 key ways that we can do that is through kind of understanding our data and understanding our performance from a sustainability point of view. And secondly, kind of immersing ourselves within various different advisory boards to understand different perspectives from legal to technology through to industry specific. The second one is to lead by example. So leaders often have great ambitious goals to reach net zero or to change their entire supply chain. But with that comes the kind of hardship of breaking down those ambitious goals into kind of smaller, more attainable goals. And with that, you kind of need to break it down into smaller parts and then kind of lead by example by bringing your team on board. So it kind of communicating the importance of reaching those goals and instilling the tools to actually achieve them. The third kind of pillar was strategic planning. So investors often highlight the ability to mitigate against or adapt to climate change as a key risk to businesses. And when businesses don't really kind of communicate that this is something that they are considering, it can not fill investors or even consumers with a lot of confidence. So strategic planning is really considering what are the most material issues from a sustainability point of view that impact our business and what is our approach to dealing with those issues. The fourth kind of pillar is around ambitious long-term goal setting. And this is kind of setting those really ambitious targets of being carbon neutral or net zero by a specific date. And realistically, those kind of targets aren't going to have a huge impact at the immediate future for a particular business, but it's kind of seen as a shared responsibility amongst society to bring those emissions down so that everybody can live in the world kind of more comfortably, essentially, without having to deal with extreme climate scenarios and in a kind of more fair society. So it's taking that one step further from just kind of considering the business to considering wider society, essentially. The fifth kind of pillar is around executive compensation being tied to sustainability performance. And this is kind of common sense, I guess. If you're incentivized to reach certain goals, you're more likely to direct your attention, focus your resources and capital on attaining those goals, and in turn, you're more likely to achieve them. The sixth pillar is tied to innovation. And this is, again, as I mentioned, moving away from business as usual, breaking the status quo of business models and inventing new ways of working, new partnerships, new solutions to do things differently, because our society is, as it stands today, is very much embedded where it doesn't kind of take into consideration environment at its core. So to change that, we need new processes, new technologies, and new ways of working. And the final kind of pillar is reporting. So a really easy way to gain confidence amongst consumers, investors, and even competition is to put out your data, your sustainability data, create that level of transparency so people can see where you're performing well, where you know you need to make improvements, and what you're exactly doing about it. So with these kind of 7 pillars, we've been talking about it predominantly from a top-down view. But I really see this as a bi-directional view. We really do need to democratize how sustainability is achieved within not only businesses, but society as a whole. And it doesn't necessarily fall to leaders of an organization to kind of achieve that. It is an extremely complex space with a lot of interconnected issues that are dynamically changing over time. So it will take exceptionally skilled leaders to attain these goals, but it will also require a lot of kind of multifaceted approaches and cognitively diverse kind of thinking. So with that, I would like to take a look at just the C-suite in a bit more detail and really understand the complexities in terms of the roles and functions of a C-suite from a sustainability point of view, but then also focus on some of the overlaps and how data can be used to look at sustainability from multiple different angles. So starting with the CEO and kind of working clockwise, the CEO is responsible for defining the future visions, setting those ambitious goals, but also considering strategic partnerships, threats, opportunities, and just generally the way that trends are affecting the business. The CFO is going to be looking at sustainability in terms of highlighting the impacts on financial planning, compliance to new regulations that are coming about, capital allocation and reporting. The operations officer will be considering everything supply chain related. So whilst they would be focused on ensuring that you have an efficient supply chain that is cost effective, you simultaneously would want to understand what are the carbon emissions associated with that supply chain, and are there any areas for new partnerships to emerge or new ways of working that can reduce those carbon emissions. The Chief Technical Officer, again, will wear multiple hats and is kind of in charge of bringing together all of that sustainability data. We often see within large organizations who still have those data silos, even if the cloud has been adopted, and you really need to bring that together. In some cases, certain sustainability data isn't being captured at all, so that processes to capture that data would need to be implemented. And likewise, even from a technology development point of view, with kind of more concerns growing over the emissions associated with AI and computing, new processes would need to be put in place to evaluate whether the ends justify the means, the means that justify the end, and really understand whether it is worth the emissions of developing a new technology. The Chief Commercial Officer would be kind of in charge of championing sustainability within the brand and marketing and sales messaging that comes out through customer experiences, product design, and innovation, with aligning that brand to sustainability. And then we have the Chief Sustainability Officer, which is a relatively new role, but they're essentially in charge of monitoring, managing progress towards the sustainability goals, and often have the power to veto any decisions that conflict with the overall organization's sustainability strategy. And then finally, the HR officer really has the role to embed sustainability within a a company culture, big or small. And that can happen through training of understanding and just generally building awareness of sustainable issues, and through talent interaction. So as you can kind of see just from looking at the C-suite, there are multiple dimensions to sustainability, but one of the kind of common threads that run through all of the roles is the need to use data. And data can be kind of used to look at the multiple different issues from different angles. So if we just take the example of supply chain data as an example, the chief financial officer would look at supply chain data and maybe pre-qualify companies for mergers and acquisitions, whereas an operations officer would look at that to understand if there are any new suppliers that have some new technology or new ways of working, or even developing new partnerships with existing suppliers. And the commercial officer would look at that to understand, is there any reputational risk? Does this align with what we're saying in our marketing and sales messaging? Is there any risk of greenwashing? So it really does take a really cognitively diverse team to look at these issues from multiple different viewpoints. And as I mentioned, it is something that organizations should be looking to democratize. And with that, you want to build power skills, tactical skills, and technical skills within teams. So just focusing on power skills, these are the type of skills we traditionally would associate with leadership or any kind of management role. And they cover things like communication, management, productivity and collaboration, and personal development. And a recent study by PwC actually showed if leadership training is given to all employees, irrespective of their role and responsibilities, that organisation is 4.2 times more likely to achieve greater revenue growth. The second kind of pillar is tactical skills. And as we kind of move to a kind of more distributed workforce type model, more and more as COVID has kind of forced us to go down, we'll see a lot of kind of cross-pollination of skills and new models of the workforce. So these skills kind of cover business intelligence, design, finance and accounting, talent development, marketing, project management, and sales and customer experience. So by giving the workforce or your teams these type of skills, they become more well-rounded individuals, are more likely to engage on various different complicated sustainability issues. And in some cases, some argue that it can help prevent churn as people are more interested by giving distributed responsibilities. And the final kind of pillar of skills are technical skills and cover cloud computing, security, data science, IT operations, and software development. And I like to see these skills as essentially how you action change. Technology is instilled in every industry in the world, and even roles we wouldn't traditionally associate with technical skills are required more and more to use them. So if we take a HR executive, for example, if they were to understand how a particular type of training is working, or feedback from the workforce on general sentiment of how they feel in their role, or how incentive schemes are working, that would require data, and you would need to build analytics and AI on top of it to really draw out important insights that can be used within business decision making. There is also an important fact there that a lot of that information will be extremely sensitive and contain a lot of personally identifiable data, which can lead to a lot of bias. So it'd be needed to be treated with sensitivity, and you would want to explore applying a lot of obfuscation security principles over the top, so people are treated fairly with that information as well. So that kind of covers leadership and team skills we'd want to build within teams of all sizes, but particularly within the sustainability arena. I want to take a few moments now just to kind of distill a lot of the noisy information that is kind of critical to building effective technical solutions, and just important to consider generally from a progressive change point of view. So this particular infographic is something I put together to try and simplify the range of ESG frameworks that are out there. So there are a lot of different scoring agencies nowadays that are providing scores on environment, social and governance performance of a lot of different organisations. And with that, there are lots of different frameworks. So it can be quite a complicated, overwhelming area, but just to simplify it, the way two parameters I see frameworks differing on are firstly in terms of the focus. So some frameworks will provide quite broad scope focus, focusing on environment, social and governance, and others will be really specific, either focusing on an industry or a particular pillar like environment. And then the second parameter is around how much detailed guidance they provide. So some frameworks will go down to the really minute detail of what units metrics should be captured in. And other frameworks will be really loosely tied to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and provide like workflow diagrams that investors or organizations can work through. So I'll just break this down a little bit further, focusing initially on this top right-hand corner. So the GRI and SASB framework are probably the most widely used. GRI was formed in 1997 and published its first framework in the year 2000. Both GRI and SASB are really broad spectrum, but also provide a lot of detailed information. So I think the last time I looked at the GRI documentation, it was like 500-600 pages long and goes into a lot of detail around the data that should be collected, even references some calculations in there as to how organisations can come to specific data points. Whereas SASB is also really, really detailed, but differs from GRI in that it's quite industry specific. So it provides metrics that should be captured for 77 different industries. So moving to the top left-hand corner, here we have frameworks that are kind of more focused on the environment pillar. So the CDP, for example, you can go onto their website and they will ask you to fill in a set of surveys which will question approaches towards forestry and water security, for example, and they'll give you a rating from A to F. And I think they have been adopted by around 13,000 companies across 1,100 different regions. Likewise, TCFD is really comprehensive, but also focuses on the environment pillar. And what we have seen kind of more recently is a lot of cross-pollination. So people recognise a lot of attention needs to be directed towards environment. And so we've started cross-pollinating and amalgamating information across different frameworks. So TCFD is now quite heavily incorporated within the SASB standards, for example. And then moving to this bottom left-hand corner, here we have kind of more specific focus on either environment or, in the case of GRESB, industry focus on real estate. But they are not providing as much detailed information as to the type of data that should be collected. And then this final right-hand bottom corner, we have the PRI, the World Economic Forum, and the UN Global Compact. And they are kind of more bodies of advisory boards, which combine NGOs, different industry professionals, policymakers, and a whole wide spectrum of people to really provide general guidance as to how you can go around collecting ESG data. So that's kind of more like the workflows that I was talking about rather than explicit metrics that should be captured. So hopefully that provides a bit more of a simplistic breakdown of ESG frameworks. Just to give you a bit more insight, I just wanted to share with you a project that I've kind of been working on for the last year with my team. And this product essentially uses the GRI standards to provide ESG scores on the FTSE 100 companies. And we have a lot of kind of AI baked into this product. So I'll kind of just give you a bit of an overview and then show you the front end, which will show you kind of some of the insights that can be taken away from there. So we start off by collecting a lot of public domain data. So this entire product is built using Azure. So we have some Azure functions collecting data on sustainability reports, asset data, social data, finance data, environment data, news data as well. And that's all going into our data lake. And then from there, we have kind of several workflows. If I just focus on this initial, the second workflow here, we have some NLP models built within Databricks that are essentially locating where different ESG metrics are within specific sustainability reports. So this is a semi-automated process as sustainability reports are kind of self-generated by organizations. There's no general standard there. So that's quite difficult. Once we do have around 200 metrics, we pre-process and clean all of that data. We normalize it, apply a series of weights and aggregation processes to put those ESG scores out. So for each company, we are putting out one ESG score, 3 pillar scores, 8 theme scores, 36 sub-themes, and then all of the ESG raw metrics and normalized metrics as well. So that's just kind of how an overall company is performing. But then we also have developed some machine learning models to predict how organizations are likely to score in the following year as well. The kind of top workflow there is then using a lot of the open source climate models and overlaying a lot of economic data, so we can see how GDP is affected by things like cyclone risk and flooding risk, droughts, wildfires, etc. And then the final kind of workflow at the bottom is heavily dependent on a lot of NLP models that we've developed. So using out-of-the-box cognitive services models, we've got some Twitter sentiment going on, but then that then feeds into a few other models, which are essentially looking at news data from credible sources that classify which company the news is about and whether it is attached to a specific controversy category. If it is, then we go through and again clean that data and apply some weights to put out a controversy score for each of those companies as well, to kind of counteract the bias of the self-reporting that we see in sustainability reports. So all of that information goes into our staging area, and then we curate it so it can be consumed either by a few different APIs that we have or through our Power BI front end. So I'll just show you that in a bit more detail. So this is the kind of overall dashboard that we have. So we have the breakdown by companies, by industry, we have the controversy and sentiment scoring there, and then we have the climate risk models here as well. I'm just going to focus on this one segment, which is showing a bit more detail around the type of data you would get following the GRI framework. So if I go down into it, here at the minute, it's showing all of the data for the FTSE 100. So I'm just going to select a specific industry just to make it a little less busy. Let's just select banks. And with that, we can also have a look at a specific company. So I'm going to have a look at NatWest, I think is in here. Yeah. There we go. So on this page, we can kind of see essentially how much data is missing. So we only collect data that's in the public domain because we see that as a bit more credible rather than sending out questionnaires as some organizations do to get a bit more data. So this is looking at how much data is missing. We do have a data quality service, which is applying a lot of statistical methods to understand if there are outliers, if the year-on-year change is extreme, and things like that. And then we have here a breakdown of NatWest's performance across the 3 different pillars of environment, social, and governance. So these scores range from 0 to 100. We can see a time series here. So at the minute it appears we only have 2020 data. For most companies, we have data going back up to 2015. And you can see the year-on-year changes here as well. But this is my favorite graphic on this dashboard, and it kind of gives you, if we go down to the theme level, we can see how NatWest perform relative to the industry average across the different themes. So we have climate change, workforce, resource use, product responsibility, human rights, etc. And if I want to focus on climate change, for example, where they seem to be doing a bit better, I can go down and view the specific metrics that we're collecting according to the GRI standards. And we've got different descriptions around how those metrics calculated, what they actually mean. So they're covering things like scope 1, scope 2, and 3 emissions, CO2 removed, if they have policies and reduction targets in place. And we can see all of the raw scores, the units, and even the normalized scores there. So hopefully that gives you a bit of insight as to the type of data you can collect through different ESG frameworks, which organisations may be interested in using. So just take you back to the presentation. Just a few more industry-specific things that I want to focus on before we'll get into a few more emissions demos. So the next kind of, I guess, interesting thing to consider is not only do we have ESG frameworks, but there are also country-level taxonomies, which initially have come about to support the endorsement of green bonds. But it's kind of, I guess, a bit of an overwhelming area, and we don't really need multiple taxonomies or multiple frameworks. And I think this is obviously recognised that we do need to have more international efforts. And with this, China and the EU are kind of working together to amalgamate a lot of the common ground within these taxonomies and develop a more international standard. So I'll just quickly cover 3 of the regulations that are often referred to in normal sustainability conversations. So we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which really focuses on corporate communication. And then the second 2 are more applicable to the finance community. And we have the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and the EU Taxonomy. So the CSRD kind of builds on the non-financial reporting directive, and it aims essentially to strengthen and standardize corporate communication for investors to be able to meet their needs for SFDR. And the main kind of difference between NFRD and CSRD is the expansion of scope. So we're no longer just considering 11,600 companies, it's closer to 50,000 companies that could apply to CSRD. In terms of the disclosure points, they essentially focus on environmental protection, social responsibility and treatment of employees, human rights, anti-corruption, diversity of board members, and double materiality. And that last one kind of focusing on issues that are not just material to the business, but also have a much more wider impact on society. The second regulation, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, as I mentioned, is more applicable to the finance community and came into effect March of 2021 with level 2 expected to be applied this year. And it's essentially, it aims to provide communications to the market around the various different types of sustainable finance strategies available on the market today. And the main kind of areas that organizations have been focusing on are the website disclosures and the pre-contractual disclosures that focus on Article 3 and 6 of SFDR. So those disclosure points are kind of focusing on how integration of sustainability risks is incorporated within investment decisions, the assessment of sustainability risks on the return of a financial product, where sustainability is deemed not to be relevant, the rationale as to why is communicated, And then obviously the final one is website publication of policies on the integration of sustainability risk within decision making. So the final regulation is really comprehensive. The EU taxonomy entered into force July 2020. It will be evaluated later this year and then every 3 years after. And this really requires investors to disclose the proportion of economic activity that qualifies as environmentally sustainable. To understand what qualifies as environmentally sustainable, they have quite a comprehensive classification system, which has 6 environmental objectives. It covers climate mitigation and adaptation, sustainable use of water, transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and the protection of biodiversity and restoration of ecosystems. So a lot of these kind of investment opportunities can align to any one of these objectives, but to ensure that you're not doing harm to the others as a result, they have 2 additional clauses: the do no significant harm clause, which has a really comprehensive technical screening criteria, and the minimum safeguards. So this kind of bottom graphic here is from a FTSE Russell Group study, and it just essentially demonstrates the workflow of the application of this taxonomy. So in this example, they are looking at electrical generation from geothermal energy. It can align to 2 of the environmental objectives, being mitigation and adaptation. And then through the do no significant harm clause, we apply technical screening criteria. If it passes that, we then consider minimum safeguards. And if it passes that, then it can be considered as aligned to the EU taxonomy. So whilst this is really comprehensive, it has received some criticism, as I think some oil and gas and nuclear energy investments have been suggested to be passed as aligned. Additionally, this particular study by the FTSE Russell Group looked at ESG metrics and data that are captured traditionally by scoring providers and companies, and they found that of 300 ESG metrics, only 43 could be mapped onto the technical screening criteria that is used to essentially understand whether something is not doing any harm to the other environmental objectives. So there is a lot of work still to be done, and it's not like something that can be on the ground running smoothly from day one. But other people have kind of suggested maybe there are other data sources that can be used to compensate in the interim, things like controversy scores. So it will be interesting to see how this space kind of evolves. And I think it's important for technologists to kind of understand what can we do to kind of help fast forward this kind of classification process to make sure that capital can be aligned in more sustainable ventures, essentially. So a lot of organisations are moving towards setting these ambitious goals, as we mentioned. And one of the ways that a lot of companies are jumping to do this really quickly is through offsetting. So that can be through the compliance market or the voluntary carbon market. So the compliance market works through carbon taxing, permits, etc., and is regulated, whereas the voluntary carbon market involves organisations setting large sums of money towards direct air capture or planting trees, investing in renewables, etc. Whilst this is great, it's not regulated. So there's also the opportunity for a lot of fraud to occur. So a recent study by Carbon Plan actually found that an organisation in California received $400 million in offsetting funds and hadn't removed a single ton of carbon, which is quite worrying when a lot of organisations are kind of putting a lot of funds in these areas to bring down their net emissions. So there needs to be also a verification process, and climate scientists have often argued that to actually verify an account that a ton of carbon has been removed from the atmosphere is actually quite a difficult process as well. Considering all of this, there doesn't seem to be any slowing down in the demand for the voluntary carbon market. And the former Bank of England Governor, Mark Carney, who also runs the UK-funded task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, kind of has predicted that carbon credits will increase by 15-fold by 2030 to an upward value of $50 billion, which is really big. So I think it is something that, again, technologists need to kind of consider. So having considered a lot of the kind of domain specific use cases and scenarios that are occurring that bring in finance and legal aspects, I just want to now focus on the technology applications. So within technology, there is a scope for a broad range of different technologies to be applied, from IoT to blockchain, cloud computing, and VR. But here I just want to focus on AI specifically. And I want to go back to the C-suite and just put together a few use cases in which predictive models could be used to really drive sustainability agendas forward. So starting again with the CEO, they might want to put together some trend analysis, understand sentiment around specific sustainability trends. The CFO may want to forecast into the future, what is the return on investment of different mergers and acquisitions? How do different sustainability actions impact the valuation of the company? And maybe even set up some models to pre-qualify relevant candidates for mergers and acquisitions. The Chief Operations Officer has multiple kind of use cases for AI, whether it's optimizing waste management, doing predictive maintenance, predictive power consumption, or even supply chain lifecycle analysis simulation. So using satellite data and understanding what are the emissions impacts, essentially. Again, the Chief Technical Officer would want to maybe forecast cloud architecture costs, and with this becoming a more prominent area within technology, they may even want to put together prescriptive models, which say, instead of using this type of technology, use this type of technology instead, because it's not always on, it's kind of more scalable, and it's going to reduce our emissions, more importantly. The Chief Commercial Officer maybe wants to look at sentiment analysis of brand reputation, maybe do some product A/B testing, and the Chief Sustainability Officer may want to actually use a lot of those ESG frameworks we spoke about and predict what is an organization's ESG score, what is their controversy score, are there any early warning models of risk that we won't meet compliance of different regulations. And then the HR officer may want to look at how different training, sustainability training, is impacting their workforce. Are we bringing emissions down by kind of influencing that cultural change through training, through incentive schemes? So yeah, again, multiple different use cases of AI within sustainability leadership. But I just want to take a look at a few use cases in a bit more depth that apply to the transition to net zero. So when we talk about net zero, we're essentially not talking about completely reducing our emissions. Naturally, organizations will produce emissions, but we want to balance that. So essentially offset it and have our output as zero, essentially. And emissions can be broken down as scope 1, 2, and 3, where scope 1 is focusing on direct emissions, things like using a heat boilers within a building, or company vehicles are kind of your direct emissions. Scope 2 covers indirect emissions, so heating and cooling. There will be emissions associated with that process as a result of the services needed for the organisation. And scope 3 is really, really broad spectrum and covers everything that are indirect emissions up and down the value chain. So right from suppliers and the emissions they kind of produce as a result of developing products, and then at the other end where consumers have maybe finished with the product and how that is then either recycled or binned. So the CDP and many others have kind of emphasised, whilst there is a lot of focus on scope 1 and 2, 70 to 90% of an organization's emissions can actually come from scope 3. And just focusing on supply chain, the CDP reported that on average, supply chain emissions are 11.4 times greater than direct emissions for an organization. So this just breaks down scope 3, and I just want to share again a few ways in which we've used AI and data to try and start understanding some of our scope 3 emissions. So here we are going to be focusing specifically on business travel and employee commuting. So scope 3 is obviously massive, and it can be quite hard to make sure that you have the relevant data sharing agreements in place to really do anything about it. But business travel and employee commuting are two areas that we've been trying to make some progressive change and understand our impact a little bit better. So how we've been doing that is for expenses, they will be put through our HR Zoho system. And we've also set out a few surveys through Microsoft Forms that ask people about their commuting behaviours pre-pandemic and in the current climate as well. So depending on the source, so if it comes from our HR system, we do leverage cognitive services and forms recognizer to extract out a lot of information, things like what is the origin, destination, mode of transport, the class of transport makes a big difference as well. So we can really map out those emissions after applying different conversion factors. So we extract out the information from HR. If it's from the forms, we just use a Logic app and extract that information that goes into storage. And then we're using a lot of DEFRA kind of conversion factors to clean the data, apply the conversion factors, and then we can start to get some quite granular data according to geography, to business unit, as to what are the emissions that we are outputting. So this doesn't cover our entire company, but here we can begin to see some trends from 2019 to 2020. And we can see kind of pre-pandemic, we had commuting and business travel emissions of around 3,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. And then in 2021, that's reduced right down to almost a tenth at 384. So whilst the immediate kind of reaction would be, okay, hybrid's obviously working really well, let's endorse that. I think that's definitely a step in the right direction, but we really need to consider that with a bit more depth. So we don't want to just offset, like push our emissions onto the general, well, our employees, but more specifically just general public, because whilst they might not be coming into the office, they will be at home potentially heating rooms that aren't well insulated, lighting rooms, and that's not going to negate necessarily the emissions to commute, depending on where they're coming from. On the other hand, they might be in an office that it has IoT sensors and heating and lighting is smartly regulated. So it really just needs to be considered quite holistically in terms of what is the actual impact of our actions there. So just a final demo from me. I came across this paper that was essentially looking to use ESG data to predict scope 1 emissions for different organizations, which I thought was quite interesting. And I think if we can have this type of model, it can be quite useful, not only for organizations to maybe provide an alternative warning signal if organizations are tied to specific controversies, suggesting they've massively reduced their emissions in some way, and also be used as a proxy for investors looking to understand whether an organisation is assessing their transitional risk effectively or not. So there is a lot of kind of applications of developing this type of model, but whether it can be done with ESG data, I thought was quite interesting. So they've used ESG data from Thomson Reuters. They've taken 13,435 annual observations from just over 2,000 global firms, and that covers 12 years of history. So they've criticised a lot of kind of more simplistic approaches, and they do apply quite a comprehensive data science approach. So they have a meta learner and elastic net, which is aggregating predictions from 6 base learners, and those 6 base learners use still quite complicated algorithms like neural nets, KNN, random forest, extreme gradient boosting, to output that. And they do achieve a greater performance of 30%. But I do have some questions and concerns around the application of this model. First of all, by having such a complicated model, it's quite hard to gain explainability, which specifically for the finance industry is really important. If investment decisions are going to be made off the back of that, they need to justify that essentially. Secondly, with having complicated models, they require a lot of data and a lot of compute power to actually train those models. So the emissions generated as a result and how often that requires retraining will also come into play. And then finally, this is using annual data, which ESG typically is. But with kind of progressive change happening at a much more granular level, I was wondering whether this would actually conform to real life and the kind of performance we actually see from organizations working towards their emissions goals. So I thought I would use our our ESG data and see if I could do this from a more simplistic approach. So just going back, so just for the people that aren't familiar with the data science lifecycle, we essentially start with a problem, which in this case, we are looking to predict emissions. Then we go on to look to see if we have adequate data. So we look at the quality of that data, understand the predictive power of features, develop more features, and then we begin to develop our models and assess them, whether they're actually performant. If they are, then we deploy them and we can employ monitoring to ensure that consistent performance is obtained. If not, we can iterate again. So that is the typical approach that I've used here. So I've read in our data and I've gone through some exploration, understanding quality and the correlations. I've reshaped it, again, looked at the kind of insights from that reshaped data, and then applied some really basic ML algorithms. So I'll just quickly take you through some of the details. So this is our ESG data. We have a lot of identifying information at the beginning, focusing on the industry, the year, the company ID, ISIN, the pillar, the theme, sub-theme, and then we get all the scores at the end. It's quite a long table at the moment. We've got the description in there, all the values, the units, where the data is missing. So these flags tell us whether data is missing or not. And then I've gone on to explore that in a bit more detail. So first of all, I started looking at whether we have enough data for the emissions. So I extracted out our scope 1, scope 2 and 3 emissions. And then I was looking at how much of that data is missing. So in this case, if our metric flag is 0, it means the data is missing. So we have 85% of our scope 2 emissions data missing in its entirety, and that is concentrated predominantly on scope 3 as expected. But I wanted to know, okay, if I look at just scope 1 and 2, do I have enough information at an industry level? Are there industries that report better on scope 1 and 2 emissions than others? And the answer is yes. So we can kind of see here, there are industries like metals, minings, capital markets, insurance, hotels and restaurants, which are doing pretty well. But then we can go right down to the bottom and things like construction and engineering, and airlines, food products, textile, reporting their scoped emissions. So I have to be selective. So I have gone on to filter that data, and I've looked at industries within the specific industry list. Are there enough companies to give me a variety of data for that specific industry? So I filter out here those industries, and I only take industries that have at least 5 for companies in each industry. So then I've gone on to look at the missing data again. And here we can kind of see that irrespective of which feature I'm looking at. So I want to understand, okay, I have the scope data filtered now, but there might be other things that contribute to predicting scoped emissions, things like, do they have an environmental policy? What are their water activities, that kind of thing. So I want to understand, do we have enough data? So the average missing data across all of those features is 22%. So it's still quite a significant amount of missing data, but it's workable. So I've gone on to clean all of that. I'll just follow through down to kind of reshaping the data. So here in the reshaping, I have essentially transformed that data from a really long data set to a really wide data set. So now, after all those identifiers, I can essentially see all of those metrics as a single column. So we end up with, I think there's about 186 different metrics. Yeah, 186, including the ESG score. So then I am going on to explore some of the correlations here. So we create some lag and lead features. I understand, just do some more visualizations. But I just want to show you the output of the correlations very quickly. So looking at the scoped emissions, we can kind of see we do have some features here that are showing some predictive power. And unfortunately, these are all kind of like tagged, but they do relate to a lot of those underlying environmental features that I was talking about around water security and recycling and things like that. Some of the negative correlations here are actually tied to some interesting things like the distribution of the proportion of female employees and things like that, which aren't obvious to scoped emissions, essentially. So after doing that, I start to apply our ML algorithms, and I've essentially split our data according to time. So anything that was pre-2019 is in our training data set, where we apply the model, and essentially it learns to understand from those predictive features what contributes to a type of scoped emission or a range of scoped emission. And then everything after 2019 is what we will test after. So I do apply a GLM, and it has an R-squared of 0.32, which is really bad. So this essentially ranges from 0 to 1, with ideal performance between 0.7 and 0.9. Anything below 0.5, and it essentially is worse than chance, essentially. So whilst this, as is expected, it's not kind of performing very well, my next reaction wouldn't be to apply a more complicated model. I would probably say I want more granular data. So I would be looking to understand, are there any kind of quarterly trends that we can put in there? Are there other environmental features we can bring in to increase the predictive power, essentially, of those scoped emissions? So that kind of brings me to the end of the talk. I hope you found it interesting. We've kind of taken that journey through dissecting a lot of complicated domain-specific information and looking at that from the positions of sustainability leadership, and then started exploring some of the applications of AI within sustainability. So if you have any feedback or questions, I'd be more than happy to take them. I'm also running another session on green AI and open source climate models next week. So feel free to join me for that too, if you're interested. Thank you. Rav, I'm not sure if we have any questions.
We don't have any questions as such. But yeah, thank you very much. I think maybe we can give it like a minute just to see if there's any questions in the chat. Probably give it a couple of seconds. I'll actually remove this.
Thanks.
Don't think there are any questions as such, but we'll see you again next week, same time, to talk about the other topics.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining in.